But you heard that, so my background is in physics and astrophysics. That's what I went to study in undergraduate. And while I was there, I actually came to, I think it was home for, was it spring break or something? I came to my first Reasons to Believe meeting back in, I'd say 2013, maybe 2012. It was when Fuzz Rana was here, so the fact that I'm speaking at a Reasons to Believe meeting is really cool because Fuzz is a big deal and it just feels good to be here now. Feels like I'm finally making it. But when I was in college, I went to study physics because I loved science. I'm sure that makes sense. But when I got there, I started to see a bunch of challenges from my classmates. They found out I was a Christian, and they were kind of wondering, all right, how do you make sense of science and faith? And digging into those questions, I never lost my passion for science, but I realized that I didn't ultimately want to be a scientist. I wanted to study science in depth in the context of understanding how it relates to my faith. And that's how I wound up in grad school studying science and religion at Talbot School of Theology. Great master's program if anyone's looking to study there. Highly recommend it. But when I got there, I realized growing up, I heard all sorts of things, whether it was on TV or in my classrooms, about the history of science or the present state of science and how it has interacted with Christianity that simply just wasn't true. And my mind was open to, or my eyes were really open to just how false, the falsehoods that we have been taught in this culture, modern day, 21st century America, about how science and religion interact with one another. So I want to give you a taste of that this morning. Just a taste. I could talk about this for days, but we're going to cover a lot of topics, but it's ultimately going to look like this. We're going to cover 5 lies that I'm pretty sure most of you have probably heard and might even believe about the science and religion interaction. And at the end, we'll cover 3 truths about how Christianity and science have interacted and should interact. So, just a quick question. Who here is familiar with memes on the internet? All right, a handful of people. Memes are a great way to gauge just how much an idea has seeped into the culture, because people come up with these funny images that are supposed to present an idea, and we see quite a few lies that way. So the lies you've heard. This is a great meme. It is a supposed quote by Ferdinand Magellan. Not a real quote. I'm just going to let you guys know that right off the bat. But it says, "The church says the earth is flat, but I know that it is round, for I have seen the shadow on the moon, and I have more faith in a shadow than in the church." All right, so who here had ever heard that back in the olden days, people taught the earth was flat? All right, I see some hands, heads nodding. Cool. So the lie that we're starting off with is this idea that the church championed this flat earth theory. There's only one problem with that. That was never really a belief of any educated person in the Western world. To understand that, let's go back to the founder of Western thought, Aristotle. Aristotle had this cosmology, this way that the universe was set up. He wrote a book called Physics, really outlining his theory. But if you look at it, you have this outer sphere of that's the heavens, right? And as you move further and further inward, what do you see? A series of concentric spheres. That should give you an indication that the spherical Earth goes way back to Aristotle. And in fact, it had to be that way because the way his physics worked was earth, water, air, and fire were organized based on their degree of heaviness, how heavy or light it was. And the lighter elements, fire and air, naturally had this inclination to go outward, away from the center, whereas the heavy elements, earth and water, had an inclination to go towards the center. Now, if you think for a moment, there's only one shape that could possibly form, a sphere. So Aristotle taught a spherical Earth. In fact, explained why, on his view, the Earth had to be spherical. And this idea continued. Fast forward a little bit, a man by the name of Eratosthenes, a Greek mathematician, he actually calculated the circumference of the Earth. This was roughly about 200 BC. So going way back, calculated the circumference of the Earth, pretty decent accuracy, just about 10% over. Now, in order to calculate the circumference, you kind of have to assume one thing about the shape of the Earth. You have to assume that it's round, right? All right, ancient Greeks. But I started talking about the church, right? So maybe you're thinking, all right, how do I know that this didn't get lost along the way once the church rose into power, right? You'd be in the same boat as a famous astrophysicist named Neil deGrasse Tyson, who tweeted in response to someone probably providing him with some of the information I just did, saying, yes, the ancient Greeks inferred that the Earth was round from the shadow during lunar eclipses, but it was lost during the Dark Ages. Now, I promise you we will talk about the Dark Ages in a few minutes, but is it true that the knowledge of the spherical Earth was ever lost once the church came into power? Well, let's see what some early Christians had to say. St. Augustine, probably like one of the all-stars of the Christian faith. You hear him quoted in just about any theological book you're ever going to read. But he wrote, during the time when it is night with us, the presence of light is illuminating those parts of the world past which the sun is returning from its setting to its rising. And that thus during the entire 24 hours, while it circles its whole round, there is always daytime somewhere and nighttime somewhere else. There's a lot of words there, but if you just kind of let it sink in, there's only one shape for which that can accurately describe: a sphere. So St. Augustine, 400 AD, clearly knew that the Earth was round. Thomas Aquinas, another all-star of the faith, he wrote, for the astronomer and the physicist may both prove the same conclusion, that the Earth, for instance, is round, the astronomer by means of mathematics, but the physicist by means of matter itself. Yet again, this is a few hundred years later. Thomas Aquinas clearly says the Earth was round. And it's not like this is some sort of point he was trying to prove. That's not a main point in the Summa Theologica, that the Earth is round. This is a sidebar comment. He expects his reader to be familiar with this. So probably one of the most popular myths that we hear is that the church taught the Earth was flat. But the reality is, the church never taught that, and really no educated person throughout Western thought ever taught that. Moving on, line number 2. This is a tweet. I like tweets sometimes because they also give a good idea of what people are thinking. Today is Copernicus's 540th birthday. You may remember Copernicus as the man who said, hey, what if the Earth went around the sun? To which the Catholic Church replied, hey, what if we set you on fire? Or maybe this one, you have Galileo discussing his discoveries with the church, and the Pope is kind of dreaming about just bashing him over the head with a telescope. So these are expressing the idea that the church opposed the heliocentric model, that is the sun-centered model of the universe, that the church opposed that because it seemed to indicate that human beings would be insignificant. Now let's think about the logic here for a minute. We have this phrase, an idiom that says, okay, oh, so-and-so thinks they're the center of the universe. And when we say that, we all kind of understand we're accusing them of thinking that they are the most important thing, right? Everyone else is less important than them. Everything revolves around them. And so the logic goes that, okay, whatever is in the center of the universe is the most important thing in the universe. So if human beings ultimately are to be the most important part of creation, human beings have to occupy the place that is at the center of the universe, which means the Earth would have to be at the center of the universe. Thus, theologically, you'd argue the church had to oppose the heliocentric model. But I mentioned someone's cosmology earlier, Aristotle. And Aristotle's cosmology was the predominant cosmology up until really in the Enlightenment, and then ultimately getting through to the scientific revolution. So let's go back to it for a second. Fire was closest to the heavens. Fire is this light, it's this pure element. Earth is this dirty, heavy element. And as a result, Earth is at the center. So if you look at the cosmology of the day, the center of the universe, far from being this exalted place, was actually a dishonorable place. It's the least glorious place in all of the universe. I'll use the term Copernican Principle a couple of times. That is the technical term if you're talking about history of science. The Copernican Principle is this idea that when Copernicus proposed the heliocentric model, it entailed a demotion of human significance. But when we look at this, just assuming Aristotle's cosmology, it doesn't really make sense to think that the center of the universe was a place of importance. In fact, go a step further, you have Dante. Dante was an Italian poet. He writes an epic poem known as the Divine Comedy. Part 1 is the Inferno. Now, his cosmology looks very similar to what Aristotle proposed, except he extends it inward towards the center of the earth. What is found at the center of the earth is none other than hell. All he did was he took the same idea of, as we go further and further towards the center, we're getting further and further away from the heavens, and thus getting more and more corrupt. So Dante gives us an idea that the center of the universe, the true center of the universe, was the most corrupt place to be, the least honorable place to be. And it's interesting to note that if Dante was only writing to the elites of the day, he would be writing in Latin, but instead he wrote his poem in Italian, which meant this concept was intended to be understood by just the common people of the day. Galileo was shown earlier, and I think this is probably one of the most hilarious aspects of this lie that we're told. People always raise him up as he was persecuted by the church, and he's the poster child for church persecution of science. But when it comes to this idea of the heliocentric model demoting humans from the place of central significance, Galileo specifically writes, "For I will prove that the earth does have motion, that is, it moves around the sun as opposed to the sun moving around the earth, and that it is not the sump where the universe's filth and ephemera collect." Does that sound like a place of importance to you? He's describing the earth on the geocentric model as the sump of the universe, where the universe's filth and ephemera collect. Very clearly not a place of importance. So we're told that when the heliocentric model came on the scene, right, people in the church opposed it because they felt it would demote human beings. The reality is the opposite would be true. Moving the human beings away from the center of the universe would actually move them closer to the heavens, farther away from the place of most corruption. I promise we get to the Dark Ages. We're getting to the Dark Ages. Favorite meme of all time when it comes to science and religion, because you see, all right, some scientific progress, getting through the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and then, oh look, Christians enter the picture and falls off a cliff, absolutely nothing for 1,000 years. That's what the Dark Ages refers to, this 1,000-year period about 400, 500 AD to 1500 AD. And the idea is that during this period of time, we had 1,000 years of darkness. The church brought about this period where there was no scientific progress and even opposed scientific progress. Historians typically refer to this period as the Middle Ages. They don't like the term the Dark Ages, and we're going to explain a little bit why. But in order for this notion of the Dark Ages to be true, you need to see two things. First, you need to see the pre-Christian Roman Empire be characterized by a lot of scientific achievements, advancements in technology, and then you need to see all of that stop as soon as Christianity became prominent. But what do we actually see? The reality is the Romans, by and large, weren't major scientists. They weren't really engaging in technological advancements. We associate a lot of that with the Greeks. But something interesting about the Romans is that they never really took an interest in the Greek scientific texts. They never even translated the Greek text. So that knowledge was largely unavailable to them from an academic standpoint, from studying the writings of early Greek scientists and thinkers. In contrast, once Christianity rose in power, we started to see some development of important inventions. I believe, I have the horse-drawn plow, the water mill, eyeglasses, mechanical clock, and I can even throw in there that the university system, this whole idea of seeking knowledge in an academic setting, came because of the Christian church's influence. But we also see that while the Romans neglected the ancient Greek texts, the early church preserved and translated the ancient Greek texts because the church viewed the knowledge that was in there as valuable, even though it was written by pagans. That's interesting. We don't hear that. I'm pretty sure if you watch Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos series, you get this idea of 1,000 years of darkness. The church sort of brought in a period of scientific ignorance, when the reality is one of the main reasons we have science today is because of the church.
I'm sorry. I heard someone say that Christians destroyed the Greek text. I assume that that's not right.
That is not right. I don't know who said that, but
the burning of Alexandria?
I can't comment on that.
It was said in an unbelievable podcast between a couple of historians, one who was claiming that Christianity didn't, benefit the world, and another was saying that it did. And one of the
Was that one like yesterday, or was that recent, or was it a while ago?
2 months maybe.
Okay. You'll have to let me know which one that was, because I haven't listened to that particular
I
podcast.
think I disagree with him, but I'm just wondering if you have any insight into that.
I don't have any specific insight into that. At the end of this, when we go through questions and answers at the end, I'll have a slide that I'll list up there with some just works consulted, some other texts that you can write down and as further resources. So just when that comes up, maybe jot a couple of those down and take a look. So the Dark Ages. The reality is there was no such thing as the Dark Ages. That's why historians don't like the term. There never was a period of 1,000 years of darkness. Oh yeah, St. Augustine, bringing him back into the picture. Part of why there couldn't have been 1,000 years of darkness is this mentality that Christians had was the book. Augustine referred to the book of nature, referring to the physical world. He viewed the world as the creation of God, like another book, similar to God gave us the Bible, which we are supposed to study. God gave us the world. And because God gave us the world, we ought to study it as well. That was the mentality that the early Christians had, which we'll see later on ultimately gets you to, you ought to study the world, you ought to engage in science. So, these three lies, the flat earth myth, the Copernican Principle, and the Dark Ages, these are very clearly false. There's really no basis in the historical text. None of the contemporary writings of whatever period you're talking about, the early church, the Middle Ages, none of them really lead you to this conclusion of the flat earth myth, that people taught the earth was flat, or that the heliocentric model made humans insignificant, or that there was a Dark Ages. So where did it come from? Well, ultimately the first two came at the late 19th century. 1897, one man put them into a textbook called The New Astronomy, and then later on in the middle 20th century, that was actually included into some university textbooks. The Dark Ages has a little bit more interesting of a backstory. That was started by Protestant historians who were trying to discredit the Catholic Church specifically, but then Enlightenment thinkers took hold of this idea and expanded it and used it to discredit all of Christian thinking throughout history. Now, in each case, we have this sense that Christianity is somehow opposing science. And ultimately, the reason we have these lies circulating in our culture today is because our culture has adopted this notion that science and Christianity, or even in general, science and religion are at war with one another. They're fundamentally at odds. As for science and religion, I am issuing a restraining order. Religion must stay 500 yards away from science at all times. Clearly, they view religion as an aggressor against science. Science will admit when it's wrong, religion will kill to prove it's right. Or another one of my favorites, can't understand science, don't worry, there's always religion. So we're told in our culture that you can't really have both religion and science. They're fundamentally at odds with one another, maybe even at war with one another. If you listen to popular scientists, like in the New Atheist category, Richard Dawkins would clearly present this. Sam Harris presents it this way. Even real scientists who are practicing today, Lawrence Krauss and Neil deGrasse Tyson, present it this way. But where did this idea come from? Well, two textbooks, supposed history of science textbooks, written at the end of the 19th century. The first by John William Draper in 1874, the second by Andrew Dixon White in 1896. History of the conflict between religion and science. History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. These are really the first books that we see in the history of scientific thought that includes discussions of science and religion being opposed to one another. The dates are significant. I mentioned late 1800s. What happened towards the middle of the 1800s? Darwin published Origin of Species. So the late 1800s, you had this debate, right? People were trying to process Darwin's theory of evolution. And a lot of the opposition came from those with religious faith. So you had these guys who more or less concocted this revisionist history of science and religion interacting in an incompatible manner so that they could say, look, these Christians or these creationists who are opposing, that's not really a term they would use, but these who are opposing evolution today are doing nothing different than what religious believers have done throughout history. They are opposing science now because they opposed science throughout history. So in essence, this idea that science and religion are at odds with one another is nothing more than an anti-religious propaganda, a piece of anti-religious propaganda that was concocted in the heat of the evolutionary debate in the late 19th century. But what happens when a culture accepts this idea that science and religion are at odds with one another for long enough? You get to a point where a culture accepts scientism. You have two flowcharts. Science is this methodical approach. You get an idea, you test it, you prove it, maybe you have to revise it. In contrast, you have faith, which you get an idea, you ignore everything you don't like and accept everything you like. Or, dear religion, pictures or it didn't happen, sincerely science. Or you could look to a real-life physicist, Sabine Hossenfelder. She writes, an hypothesis that is not falsifiable through observation is optional. You may believe in it or not. Such hypotheses belong into the realm of religion. So what's ultimately going on here? You're basically saying you have science, and with science, you can actually know things. And then everything else, where you can't know anything, that's just opinion. The only way to obtain knowledge is through science. That's what this term scientism means. Religious claims, nothing more than opinion. They're more or less meaningless. Now, where we're at right now is we're kind of on the cusp of this. But when scientism is accepted in a culture, religious claims like Christianity get placed outside of what we can call the plausibility structure. The plausibility structure, to quote philosopher J.P. Moreland, is basically those ideas for which a culture is, will generally consider to be reasonable. If Christianity is outside of the plausibility structure, it's not so much that people think it's false. It's that people think it's not even worth considering. If you tell me that there's a dragon flying out the window right now, I'm not going to think about it much because that's outside of my plausibility structure. If we let scientism take hold in the culture, which, again, that tweet from Sabine Hossenfelder, it's pretty prominent in the sciences. I saw it with many of my classmates in college. Christianity, it's not a question of true or false, it's a question of why should I care? But the problem, scientism. Main problem with scientism, it's self-refuting. Self-refuting basically means if you take what the claim is making and apply it to itself, then you prove it's false. It's not just false, it's false necessarily. It couldn't possibly be true. What do we have here? Think about it. The claim that only empirically verifiable statements can be true. I'll give you all day to think of a way to test that empirically. You're never going to. It's not in itself an empirically verifiable statement. So it fails to meet its own standards. It's false necessarily. But we can also point to things that maybe science can't answer. I think the most important point to point out is that it's false necessarily. It couldn't possibly be true. But think of the beginning of the universe. We can scientifically test all this stuff in the universe to point to the beginning. But if science is testing that which occurs within the universe, you can't actually test anything outside of the universe by only testing in the universe. So we can explain the beginning of the universe with philosophy, theology, we can start answering those questions, but you can't actually test to get an answer using science. And I will also argue that the origin of consciousness. You're never going to be able to test scientifically and explain consciousness. That may be a bit more bold of a statement because I know there are many out there who would disagree with me on that, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. So what have we learned here so far? Just easy question to throw out there if someone wants to ask. Did the church teach the earth was flat? No. Did the heliocentric model mean that it meant humans were insignificant? No. Did the church bring about the Dark Ages? No. Are science and religion incompatible? No, that was a myth. That was just made up, propaganda. And is science the only way to obtain knowledge? Absolutely not. All right, these are the lies. Ready to hear some good news? Ready to hear the truth? Bob is checking his clock. I'll make this quick. Truth number one, science or Christianity is a historical catalyst for science. What do I mean by that? What I mean ultimately is that Christianity itself was a major factor in producing this whole enterprise that we call science today. This idea that we set up these methodical tests and we can obtain knowledge from studying the universe, that notion, we have that today largely because of the influence of Christianity throughout history, the influence of Christians exercising their faith throughout history. I want to be careful, though. I am not claiming that before or apart from Christianity there was no science. There were people who had practiced science before Christianity and apart from Christianity, but Christianity is ultimately responsible for how we have science today. That's the point that I'm going to make here. And to help see that, I tend to draw a distinction between technology and science. Technology I think of as this, we seek to study the universe, we study the world, we obtain this knowledge for the purpose of accomplishing a task. We want to, build a better bridge, build a better building, build a better computer, or I would even go so far as to say the Human Genome Project, major scientific endeavor, but there were ultimately purposes in the world of medical technology. That's the goal behind that. Whereas when we engage in science proper, we're looking for knowledge of the universe so that we can have knowledge of the universe. I like bringing up the Ligo experiment. I don't know how many are familiar with Ligo, but that's this experiment that detected gravitational waves about 3 or 4 years ago now, was when the first report of gravitational waves came through. I love the Ligo experiment, but I'll be the first to admit there is really no practical application of me knowing that we can detect gravitational waves. But the knowledge is significant. The knowledge itself is valuable. That's sort of this underlying idea that I think characterizes science. And as we mentioned before with Augustine, I swear this is the last time he'll make an appearance, for the same quote too, the book of nature as the production of the creator of God. This idea, God created the universe. The universe is therefore worth studying. Nicholas Copernicus, similar idea. He wrote, "So great certainly is the divine handiwork of him who is himself the greatest and the best." Copernicus, who we saw there's this whole anti-religious meme or lie made up about him, well, he had a very strong Christian faith and used that faith to gain inspiration for what to study and how to study. He clearly, based on that quote right there, viewed the universe as worth studying because of its origin, because the universe came from God. Johannes Kepler, another major scientist in history. The laws of planetary motion that we have, Kepler's 3 laws, he was a giant, and similarly, his faith was essential to his life. Again, believed the universe was created by God, and therefore wanted to understand how it worked as a result of that. Blaise Pascal. Pascal is so significant in the sciences. He has both a programming language and a unit of measurement named after him. He, let's see, first digital calculator. I found that to be kind of cool. What many consider to be the first digital calculator back in the 1600s. But if you are in the world of apologetics, you've probably heard of Pascal's wager. It's this major apologetic tool that is, while people may not agree with it entirely, it has some staying power. So clearly had this whole science and faith thing figured out. He had a balance between the two. But let's think about what he said about the universe. He wrote, "Let man then contemplate the whole of nature in her full and grand majesty." Okay, why is the universe grand? The universe is grand because it was created by God. I could probably find dozens of scientists throughout history. We could be here all day just going through scientist after scientist, and we'll see a trend, which I'm sure you saw there already. Belief in the God of the Bible, belief that God created this universe, led these earlier thinkers to desire to study the world. That's what gave us science as we know it today, because this spanned throughout hundreds of years as science was being developed. So Christianity as a force of history spurred many of the greatest minds to studying the physical world. And I would argue as Christianity was probably the biggest and most positive influence on science today, or when compared to any other worldview. Truth number 2. Christianity is a philosophical catalyst for science. See a theme with the title of the truths? What do I mean by this? Christianity is a philosophical catalyst for science. That ultimately means that if we start with Christianity, it gives us some of the philosophical presuppositions that we need if we are to engage in science in the first place. It's a catalyst for science. And the second part of this is the same can't be said of other worldviews. But with Christianity, we actually get a rational basis for science. I'm going to list 3 requirements for science. We can come up with more if we really want to, but this is a good starting point. First, the universe must be intelligible. That pretty much means that in principle, the universe can be studied, observed, and you can reach true conclusions based on observations of the universe. It's intelligible. Number 2, the universe must contain intelligent creatures. The fact that if you want to have science, you must have beings who exist who have the capacity to make observations and reach conclusions. And then third, you have to have inquisitive creatures. Creatures who, in addition to just being intelligent, they have to have a desire to learn. They have to have a desire to study the universe. And I'd argue that if we start with Christianity, we have doctrines that ultimately entail these sorts of requirements for science. The doctrine of creation, starting point. The same God who created, or who gives us our scriptures, created the universe. The universe created by an intelligent designer, an intelligent God. You would expect that there would be some sort of rationality to it. You would expect it to be an understandable world. Intelligible. The doctrine of God. We have these characteristics of God: omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent. If God is all good, God created this universe, and he has this desire for relationships, right? That's part of his omnibenevolence, is a relational attribute to his character. If God desires this, then we would expect not only to be able to understand the world, or the world to be understandable, for it to be intelligible, we would expect that he would create creatures capable of being in relationships, right? The ability to use logic and reason. And then the doctrine of man. Similarly, God created mankind in his image. There's a lot of debate about what specifically that means, but something that's essential to that is the ability for us to be in relationships with each other, be in relationships with him, and have a longing, have a desire to be in relationship with him. Intelligent creatures with an inquisitive nature, or intelligent and inquisitive creatures. But I mentioned the same cannot be said of other worldviews. Let's take atheism, for example. I argue that if we start with atheism, then we don't have a rational basis for science to begin with. Atheism cannot justify science, plain and simple. If we start with atheism, all that happens is physical matter moving according to physical laws. That's it. There's no room for agent involvement. It's just physical matter and physical laws. What does that leave you without? It leaves you without free will, the ability to actually make choices, because you have just physical matter, physical laws. Nothing is making a choice one way or another. Everything is just doing what it's doing. And you can't have any sort of rationality. Think about it. If you can't make choices, you can't enter into some process of deliberation where you're, all right, I'm weighing the options over here, I'm considering the consequences over here. I like to think of it like a calculator. A calculator may be able to spit out the answer that 2 + 2 = 4, but the calculator doesn't go into this process of thinking, all right, well, what is 2? What is addition? What does the equal sign mean? No. It's set up a certain way so that given the input, it spits out the output. Our brains, our identities work the exact same way if nothing more than the physical universe exists. Our brain chemistry just does what it does. We receive inputs, spits out outputs. We can never engage in a process of deliberation. If we can never engage in a process of deliberation, we can never set up experiments and reliably reach conclusions based on what we observe. We had no choice. What we conclude is what we conclude, regardless of whether it makes sense or not. So atheism, therefore, leaves us without any justification for science. So while Christianity provides us with the philosophical tools we need in order to engage in science, other worldviews do not. And finally, Christianity is a theological catalyst for science. This shouldn't be a surprise given what we looked at with many of the early scientific thinkers and the significance that they saw in their Christian faith. But ultimately, this means that when we take a look at our Christian faith and we practice it consistently, we ought to care about science. We ought to value studying the physical world. And I think this is significant because there's this caricature in our culture, and unfortunately there's a lot of truth to it, that Christians come off as being afraid of science. I frequently would watch The Big Bang Theory or Young Sheldon, and there's obviously this idea that Christians are afraid of science. I don't think that's going to come to a surprise to anyone in this room that a lot of people think that. And this ultimately is it's kind of personal to me, because a few years ago I was once asked to meet with a high school boy. His mom knew that I studied science and wanted me to talk to her son, who she saw had an interest in science, because she wanted him to see, yay, look, there's this Christian who has a passion for science too. So I'm always glad to talk about science and religion, hence why I'm here. But I get and I sit down with this kid for lunch, and he starts talking to me, and he's telling me about, yeah, well, I was reading A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, and when my mom saw me reading it, she took the book away from me and hid it from me. Now, what kind of message do you think that sends to her child? Well, science isn't something that we should really care about. Granted, she did replace it with stuff that she had vetted, but she wouldn't let him read the scientific text that he was interested in. He picked up on it right away, and he pretty much just said, yep, she's afraid of science. And although historically that hasn't been the case for Christians, recently that's the mentality. That's why this is so personal and so significant, because if we don't correct this, if we don't correctly see how our theology should encourage us to study science, we end up allowing situations like that to keep happening. So I argue Psalm 19, one of my favorite psalms. I could read the whole thing, but in the interest of time, I'm going to put up verses 1 and 2. But I encourage everyone to read this psalm, one of my favorites. It's all about the glory of God. It's all about who God is, how wonderful God is. But it starts off like this. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. Just let that sink in for a minute. That's opening this psalm that's all about the glory of God. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. This is, although I didn't discover the psalm until years later, this is the sensation I got when I took my first astronomy class in high school. I was 15 years old. That's when I knew I was going to study astrophysics in college, by the way. When I took that first astronomy class, you can ask my mother, she can confirm. I was bringing home books on dark matter from the library. But this is exactly what I saw. I looked at the universe and I saw, this is awesome. This is glorious. And this continued throughout college. When I was in college, I even remember commenting on, like, look, it's not there's no opposition with my faith in science. My knowledge of science, the more I learn, the more and more glorious I can see, the more and more glory I can see in God himself because of how much glory I see in his creation. This is exactly what I saw and what I hope each and every one of you can see. Verse 2, day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they reveal knowledge. So it's a step further. It's not just that the world is beautiful, right? That the world is glorious and it shows that God is glorious, but we can obtain knowledge. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. That is why, as Christians, we can look at the study of the physical world as ultimately an act of worship, right? This whole psalm is about the glory of God. It ends with a plea to let the psalmist let his words and actions be an act of worship to God. We can obtain knowledge by looking at the creation, and we can do that as an act of worship. That's exactly what the early Christians thought. That's exactly what we ought to think today. So Christianity, if we take our faith seriously and we develop a sound doctrine of creation, a sound theological system, we ought to value the study of the physical world. The question no longer should be, why should I bother to study science? The question ultimately should be, if I believe that the God I worship created this universe, why wouldn't I want to study it? So we talked a lot about various topics. Part 2, Christianity is a historical catalyst for science, Christianity is a philosophical catalyst for science, and Christianity is a theological catalyst for science. I hope that most of you walk away today feeling like, a lot of these lies I have heard, and I'm glad that they're now corrected. And I hope you feel encouraged by looking at the truth of how Christianity has interacted and should interact with science. So with that, I'm open for questions. And I promised I would leave this slide up. So for those of you who want further resources.